It's day 281. It's also February 11th, 2020. And we're on Jekyll Island in Georgia. You ever wake up in the morning and ask yourself, what am I doing? And more importantly, why? Yeah, me too. Hi, my name's Craig, and this is my story. A story about life out there. For visuals while listening, search Life Out There on your favorite social media platform or use the links in the podcast description. Man, I was itching to get back here. I love this place. It's beautiful, of course, but so much history. I found a quote from the island's official website. From the early Native Americans to guests from around the world, the story of our island has been captivating the imaginations of explorers for generations. In 1733, General James Oglethorpe named Jekyll Island in honor of Sir Joseph Jekyll, his friend and a financier from England. In the late 1800s, Jekyll Island became an exclusive hunting club for families with names like Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt, Pulitzer, and Baker. The once private retreat is now part of the Jekyll Island Club National Historic Landmark District, and it's one of the largest preservation projects in the Southeast. In 1947, the governor and the Georgia State Legislature established Jekyll Island as a state park, and today, the island is a special sanctuary for each of us, and the Jekyll Island Authority is proud to share our island's history. Close quote. Even driving across the causeway onto Jekyll Island is an adventure. The way the road weaves through and across the expansive and wide-open marshlands of southern Georgia. As you transition from these marshland roads to the bridge, before you know it, you've driven 3 miles from Brunswick, Georgia, across those intracoastal waterways onto an island. A universe in which nature and history come together seamlessly. And you can tell just by looking around, or just sitting on a beach, that the two have always been as one here, from the very beginning, or as far back as today's science will take us anyway. The coastal plain region we're in began to form, and with it Jekyll Island, some 100 million years ago. I look around here and imagine a time when the erosion of surrounding areas would begin depositing sediments, the sediments that would later become the foundation on which I'm standing right now. How day after day, century after century, epic even, which I just learned is the term that actually references a period of time spanning millions of years. And that sediment deposition would continue for those millions of years. Until a couple of million years ago, when glacial cycles would have dramatic impact on sea levels across the globe, and where I'm standing, the barrier islands would form, one of which, Jekyll Island. And as the infant island began to grow and mature, developing a nature of its own, humans would find their way here some 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. Those Timucuans, a now extinct people that I had just learned about in the last episode. The Timucua, or specifically subcultures of the Timucua, the Huale and Macama, would somehow figure out that if they hollowed out a log, they could climb in some of the earliest versions of a canoe and begin exploration of the marshlands that passed seemingly forever into the horizon. They seemed to know there was something out there. But how? In a time before maps, airplanes, certainly before we had GPS devices in our pockets, how could they have possibly known that there was a nearly 6,000-acre oasis out here, something would drive them to navigate that 3 miles of intracoastal waterway and find this place. And once they found it, they knew it was special. And they stayed for thousands of years. Next up, those Spanish explorers, the first Europeans to arrive in the area. They'd mapped the island as Isla de Bañas, which meant Whale Island. The next to document discovery, later in the 1500s, would be the French explorers, and they'd mapped their find as Île de la Somme, referencing a river in France. And then the colonial era, in the 1700s, would bring British colonists to the area when General James Oglethorpe founded the colony of Georgia and named the island in honor of that major financial backer back there in Britain. At times, the island would also be referred to as Horton's Island, in honor of the man that established one of the first plantations on it. And when the island was sold to another plantation owner, Christophe Poulain Dubignon, it would sometimes be referred to as Dubignon Island. But Jekyll Island is the name that would stick. In 1886, the island was purchased by a group of wealthy industrialists who formed the Jekyll Island Club, a private retreat for America's elite. The club era lasted until World War II, after which the island would be sold to the state of Georgia in 1947 for $675,000. That's about $8 million in today's money. But in the years following the war, the island would be largely abandoned and fall into disrepair. Those wealthy patrons of the club era had stopped coming. But during the 1950s, Georgia would begin investing in their purchase. First up, another $800,000 investment. That causeway and bridge we just crossed. It was completed in 1954. And the state would spend the rest of the decade investing in infrastructure, roads, drainage systems, and accommodations for visitors. So with access to the island opened up and infrastructure improving rapidly, the next 2 decades would bring significant growth in tourism and recreational activities, while the state's focus shifted to conservation and preservation of not only the natural beauty of the island, but all those historical structures left behind by the club era, as well as the plantations that had been established nearly a century before that. And by the 80s and 90s, the word was out, and Jekyll Island continued to modernize, adding amenities like the Summer Waves Water Park, bike trails, walking paths. The Jekyll Island Authority manages the island, somehow balancing that continued growth and prosperity with that preservation of all the history here. And the island's full-time population today, well, it's relatively small. Around 900 Georgians call Jekyll Island home. But those 900 Georgians, they play host to over 3 million visitors every year. And today, I was one of them. Happy to drop $10 for my all-day parking pass. I did make a quick mental reference to the fact that the parking pass was double what it had been during my first visit back in 2002. I also, because I'm me, I guess, did some quick math. 3 million visitors a year. $10 a car. I wonder how many cars that was. Georgia is raking in some dough. And once you see what they've done with it, and what they're doing here, money well spent, Georgia. But for me, today wouldn't be about any of the touristy stuff. The fancy hotels, the awesome food, the museums, the walking tours, the incredible restoration projects, and the ones still underway. It seems that work will never end here. It's serious business, preserving the past. I wanted to feel some more of that history, like standing in front of a historical marker and learning the story of the Wanderer, a schooner-rigged vessel originally built in 1858 as a luxury pleasure yacht in New York, but it would later be converted into a slave ship. And during the one documented journey it would make, on November 28, 1858, it would arrive at Jekyll Island under cover of darkness after a 42-day and 4,600-mile journey from the Kingdom of Congo in Africa, with over 400 enslaved Africans aboard. And this voyage and the ship's passengers would be documented as one of the last illegal attempts to bring enslaved people into the U.S., and it significantly heightened tensions between the North and the South, and cementing the nation's path to the Civil War. The war that would begin within 3 years of the Wanderer's landing. The Wanderer would later be confiscated by Union forces and used for various military purposes throughout the war, and then decommissioned and converted back to merchant use. And ultimately, the Wanderer would be lost to the sea and laid to rest off the coast of Cuba in 1871. Thinking through everything and everyone that vessel experienced in just 13 years, I'm not sure what this feeling is. I suppose it's a lot of things, but good isn't one of them. And just up the path from that historical marker, that Horton house, and the remnants of that plantation, almost 300 years old, and another example of the tabby structures built during the era. And a few minutes later, I was reading of how the generations of enslaved Africans would hold on to the memory of the homeland they had been torn away from. The one that some would never know, were it not for their parents and grandparents telling them. How they had managed to hold on to who they were, bringing their own traditions, religions, and culture into a world they knew nothing of, but they had to have hated it. And how they worked so hard every day, as if knowing that the insanity around them, the so wrong in it all, would someday be a thing of the past. I mean, humans couldn't get away with treating other humans like this forever, could they? Man, that's a lot to have swirling around in my head and my heart when I'd reached the foot of the stairs to the Sanssouci, the site that was the island home to the Rockefellers, built during that club era, a place that would host some of the richest people on the planet. And it was also the site of a 6-unit building considered to be one of the first condominium complexes built in the United States. Or walking into the lobby of the Jekyll Island Club Resort and trying to imagine what it must have looked and felt like in 1910, when under the cover of night and using only first names to keep their identities secret, Senator Nelson Aldrich led a party of financial leaders to Jekyll Island to conceptualize a federal banking system. The group would be coined as the First Name Club, and together, that group drafted what would become the modern-day Federal Reserve, which passed legislation and was born in 1913. And I wondered, why did it have to be such a secret? Well, the internet tells me it was because the concept of a centralized bank, a single institution that would oversee the country's monetary system and be responsible for policy-making decisions around it, was pretty controversial stuff at the time. That group of 6 super smart men, all from either the government or the banking world, they did not want media nosing about and causing a hubbub. They also knew that there would be political opposition, and they needed privacy to draft their plan and prepare to ensure that legislation would pass quickly. So I guess it makes perfect sense that an exclusive rich guy island off the coast of Georgia, accessible only by boat, really, was the perfect place to hold a super-secret meeting. During the hour or so drive back to St. Mary's this evening, so much swirling around in my brain. I started to contrast the nutty stuff going on in the world today with the elements of horror in our past. It feels beyond ignorant to ask, why was I never told this? And yeah, I wasn't told. But by the same measure, I never asked. I'm learning, time and time again on this adventure, that there's a stark contrast between what I thought I knew and what I was actually taught, what I actually know. So what should I be asking today? I wondered, in a couple hundred years, what historical marker will a guy like me be standing in front of, reading, what I should know now, but didn't? And the pondering continued, well into the evening walk with Dougie. It was evolving into knowing when to talk, and knowing when to keep quiet and listen. Knowing when to just believe what you hear or read or are told. And knowing when to dig deeper, ask questions. And knowing that when emotion and anger enter a conversation, because they oftentimes do these days, knowing that I'll learn a whole lot more when I stop talking and start listening. Focus on understanding. The day on Jekyll Island had for sure taught me that if the topic is slavery, the only thing I know for sure is that there's still so much more I don't know. There's a few things I understand a little more, I think, now. Like, Americans didn't invent the concept. I mean, instances of the practice go back thousands of years all across Europe and Asia. And it would be the Spanish that would bring enslaved people with them during their discovery of North America. But 200 or 300 years later, those young Americans were quick to grasp the concept and put their own spin on it. But I guess, to their credit, a practice that had existed for thousands of years would take the Americans less than 100 years before the young nation would be at war with itself. The war that would last 4 years and ultimately abolish the practice in the United States. But even though one side claimed victory and the other side conceded, the deeply wounded nation tried to move on. But did we? We certainly never, effectively anyway, dealt with the fallout. The fallout of knocking on a human's door one morning and announcing, "You're free," throwing a few bucks in their pocket, making a couple of promises, then taking those back, and casting them out into a world in which nearly half the population had fought to keep them enslaved. A population that literally hated them, and showed it by immediately beginning to kill them. It's been 155 years since that knock on the door, and I wondered, what more could be done? What have I done? What can I do? In moving closer to the hope that as a nation, as a culture, we can someday soon decide to deal with it. And also, for sure, if I ever did believe that ignorance is bliss, well, I certainly don't now. After the walk with Dougie, it was pretty obvious to me that the evening would be spent immersed on the internet. But first, Less than a mile or so up the road, Dougie and I had discovered the local tavern, the Bucket, early on during our walks. It felt like the perfect evening for a walk up the street before digging in. It's a great little place, the Bucket. As I walked in, I was surprised to see Jim stand up from the bar and come over for a handshake. I thanked him again for his help and assured him that Sharon had indeed taken good care of us. I told him of the day's discoveries on Jekyll Island, and he brought me up to speed on his move into a friend's house. Seems that a divorce had landed him in a homeless situation for a stretch, so he was going to crash with a friend up the road till his new place was ready. And it turns out his friend's place was just across the street and up a stretch from where I was parked. I invited him to stop by any time. I'll be sure to keep some beer in the fridge. He said he would for sure. Paying the tab and headed out, Mary, the bartender, hollered after me, "Don't forget Taco Tuesday." And I'd learned that each Tuesday, the tavern offered up free tacos from 12 to 4. Sort of a neighborhood potluck sort of thing. Bring whatever you like. Or nothing. We don't much care, she said. Just come by. There's always plenty of food. I waved, thanked her, and told her most definitely you'll see me on Taco Tuesday. An hour or so later, back in front of the laptop, there was that one more click thing. And the story of the forgotten battles and black refugees. The events took place during the War of 1812, another example of a war fought on U.S. soil that I knew little about, until getting here and learning of the British occupation of St. Mary's during that war. A war that would be fought between 1812 and 1815. It turns out that the 36 years that had elapsed since the U.S. Declaration of Independence, well, they weren't exactly smooth sailing. And the two would go at it for another 3 to 4 years. This time, it was the British getting in the way of U.S. expansion and maritime rights along the southeast coast. The British were also engaged in actual support of Native Americans in the region. They were using them to further hamper U.S. expansion. And given all this, no surprise that the two would start shooting at each other again. And ultimately, that battle would end in a stalemate of sorts, pretty much just putting things back the way they were before the war. But it did reestablish relations between the two countries. But during that war, British Vice Admiral Alexander Cochrane issued a proclamation in April of 1814. The proclamation encouraged American slaves to escape and board British ships as freed men bound for British colonies. And hundreds of slaves would take the British up on their offer, escaping plantations across the region and boarding British ships that were anchored off the Georgia coast and Cumberland Island. Many of these black refugees were transported to places like Nova Scotia and Bermuda, where their descendants still live today. Some black males even served as colonial marines in the British militia and ultimately settled in Trinidad after their service. And many of these newly freed slaves, now considered British, would actually find themselves in combat during the war, engaged in gun battle against the Americans they had just escaped. Wow, so much crazy history. My brain was full for the day. And tomorrow, I'm thinking Fernandina Beach, maybe. It's just 30 or so miles away, across that Florida state line, on another island. I've heard fun things about the area, so maybe go for a look-see. And I wonder what we'll learn there.
Turns out, this thing called life comes with a lot of rules. Maybe it's time to break a few.
Because you can.
No, seriously,
You can.